As we discussed in the strategy session, we can't control the strategy for the entire movement, but we can think strategically within it. Strategy is about making decisions about how we go about getting to where we want to be. Remember the whole map thing. And those decisions are based on assumptions. We can be conscious or unconscious of how our assumptions show up in the decisions that we make. One of the key assumptions that informs our decisions in terms of building a strategy is about who has power. So we're going to spend this session talking about power. And one way to think about power is simply the means to get things done, or as MLK called it, the ability to achieve purpose and the strength to bring about social and economic change. So that's kind of how we think about power at NEON and the working definition that we'll be using in this session. We're going to start off looking at the triangle model that's in your participant guides, the one that has kind of monolithic and social next to it. And this is a model that Gene Sharp, who was a writer and educator on non-violent direct action, developed in the 1970s. And this model kind of recognizes that there are broadly two views of power at play in movements. Of course, there are many more, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but this is a good jumping off point. So looking at that model, you have the monolithic part, so that's the top of the triangle. And a brief explainer of that is that many of us have been raised in cultures that teach us that power lies in the hands of an anointed few, and that society is designed in such a way as to concentrate power to make decisions in the hands of those few people. We're told this, but we also experience it in our families, at school, in the streets, the way that our histories are presented or erased. Our work is structured like this, media presents things like this. And so a lot of people take the approach to tackling issues in society of saying, okay, we need to target those decision makers. We need to go for the people at the top if we want to really kind of make a change to the entire pyramid. The social view of power is based on the idea that the people hold the power. So the people at the top of the triangle only rule with the people's consent. So the boss relies on the consent of the workers to show up to work, for example. Without that, he has no power. So if we want to make change, then we should target those people because that's where the true power lies. So that's a kind of brief explainer of the model. As we said, it's much more complex than that. And a really crucial thing to name is that we're not saying that one view of power is necessarily right or wrong, but we are saying that if you're clear on your view of power, it can really help to inform your strategy and make your strategy more effective. And that other people in your group or movement might have a different view of power to you. And that might show up in their approach to change and lead to conflict, which it can be really difficult to dig into what that conflict's about if you're not being explicit about your view of power. The more that we can make our assumptions explicit, the more that we can understand why we might not agree on a specific approach and get aligned on what strategic direction to take our work in. So the view of power isn't about who you're talking to directly. Lots of activists think they have a social view of power when they're mobilizing lots of people or targeting the public. But if they're ultimately doing that in order to get elites to change their minds, then it is actually a more monolithic view of power. Like with the movement ecology, it's really important to remember that it's about the ends, not the means. As you're probably getting by now, a lot of movement builders is about giving us models. So we have a shared understanding and a shared language to help us better collaborate within social movements. So to help you with this, alongside the movement ecology, we've developed another spectrum for understanding the approaches to change that exist in social movements. The two major and distinct paradigms that have organically evolved, cooperated and clashed throughout struggles for social justice can be boiled down to inside game and outside game. So you'll see this diagram in your participant guides. And I'm just going to take you through the two different approaches. So inside game, the focus of attention when people are doing this kind of work is decision makers. So it's that monolithic view of power that we talked about. The approach might be linked to specific policy demands or legal change, things that are outcomes that are concrete and material. Legislative, policy, priority changes in government, corporations, these kind of things. Outside game, the focus of attention is the public or constituent groups within the public. So that's much more aligned with the social view of power. This approach demands broad shifts in public opinion. That's kind of the ultimate outcome, alongside cultural change, creating new normals around issues in terms of public attitudes and behaviors and things like that. So there's lots of things that influence the game that we choose to play, whether our organization focuses more on inside game or outside game tactics. And it's really rare that we get to kind of choose the game that our group plays. So, you know, when we join a group, even if we're leading it, often there is a kind of established culture around the approach to making change that group takes, and the view of power that they act upon. Our groups often have a sometimes unspoken cultural commitment to a particular approach, or more hierarchical organizations might not always create the space for people to actually decide on what strategy, inside game or outside game, they want to pursue. And even if we do have control of the strategy, and we feel that we have a social view of power, it might not always feel like the sensible or realistic approach. Whereas inside game, which can have more short-term winnable objectives, can be much more appealing. And all this to say, if we're not really conscious of the game that we're playing and our view of power, we might kind of get really caught up in conflict or confusion, or just kind of political misalignment, really, when it comes to working with our group and with others. That can be a real barrier to movement consciousness and that kind of cohesion that we really want to achieve. But like the movement ecology, this model, this kind of inside-outside game thinking alongside the power triangle, can really help you to appreciate and better understand the work of other people, and to understand that you don't need to do everything yourself. It's about making a core contribution to a wider movement. So some of the questions that you might reflect on are your own view of power, what game that you're playing, to what extent do those two things align. But crucially, we want to really foster here greater movement appreciation again. So we want to be thinking about not just the idea that there are these two views of power and one of them aligns with mine and I'm going to discount the rest. But actually, when we look at the entire movement ecology and when we look at the change that we're trying to achieve in these different legacies, so we want cultural So we want cultural legacies, activist legacies, and legislative legacies. We can really start to understand that actually we need people doing inside game, outside game, with social views of power, monolithic views of power, people who are challenging dominant institutions, who are doing personal empowerment, who are building alternatives, in order to kind of create that huge vehicle for holistic collective social change that can kind of smash through the problem into the world that we want to see. The final piece of the puzzle when it comes to power is thinking about demands. So this piece kind of nestles within the two models that we've talked about, so the power triangle and the inside-outside game spectrum. It's really important to consider the demands that your movement is making and what they say to your audience. And a really important part of strategy is measuring the overall impact of the movement. And you can only really do that if you're really clear on what your initial assumptions were, both about power and the change that you wanted to achieve. Just like with inside-outside game, although it's not always the case, generally speaking, in order to win a specific policy or legislative change, groups playing the inside game will make instrumental demands. And instrumental demands are generally oriented towards the decision makers of dominant institutions. So that's your top part of the triangle, your monolithic view of power. These instrumental demands are specific and they're winnable within the political climate of the time. For instance, an instrumental demand might be a legislative or policy change like the living wage for employees or increasing government funding for a public service. Some of the strengths of instrumental demands are that they're concrete, they're tangible, and when they're won, it can really achieve big change in people's lives. They can also provide clear motivation and a distinct pathway for new members to join your group. The weaknesses of instrumental demands are they're not as inspiring always. The public might not always know about or intuitively understand instrumental demands. You might have to spend a lot of time explaining the nitty-gritty and why it matters, which can muddy the waters sometimes around exactly what we're trying to achieve. And they can also ultimately fail to galvanize people to action and then lead to the kind of large-scale mobilizations that we want to see, and also maybe large-scale disappointment if that particular piece of legislative change or policy isn't achieved. In contrast, in order to shift public opinion, groups playing the outside game will often make more symbolic demands. So symbolic demands are popular demands which are oriented to the broader public and intended to convey a big picture and big ideas. So they aim to galvanize people to action and appeal to popular convictions and desires. So rights and justice for immigrants, free healthcare for all, higher education as a right, not a privilege. They might take many years to win, but they mobilize a lot of people in the process, and they also create shifts in the cultural norms around an issue, which can be huge movement victories. Some strengths of symbolic demands are that they inspire people to take action. They tap into their values and their beliefs, and people are much more likely to take to the streets to fight for freedom for all people than they are to pressure their local Sainsbury's to change the use-by dates on eggs. They can also radically shift the dominant narrative around an issue, paving the way for more instrumental demands to be rolled out behind the scenes. Some of the weaknesses of symbolic demands, though, are that they can often seem a bit pie in the sky. It can be unclear what the route to victory is, or even what victory would look like. Movements that advance symbolic demands can also sometimes be accused of making a mountain out of a molehill or turning people off the issue. So really what we can see through analysing these two together is that we need both. We need organisations and movements that are painting that bigger picture, that are advocating for huge galvanising social change that can bring people together, as well as people advocating for those more instrumental demands that make people feel like, right, this is actually something that we can win. And it's when we have those two working in symbiosis, so just like the inside-outside game, just like monolithic view of power, that we can win.